This is Silent Valor, where hearts meet courage. Subscribe now, and thank you for giving me your support with just one click. The fog hung low over Fort Canyon's training range, muffling the sound of boots scraping against gravel and swallowing the edges of the horizon. 18 recruits stood in formation, their breath faint in the chilly air, their rifles slung with the casual arrogance of men who had survived 5 weeks of brutal conditioning and now believed themselves invincible. Their laughter broke through the mist, sharp and nervous, disguising fear with bravado. On the far wooden bleachers sat a man no one had accounted for, a solitary figure holding a long wooden case across his knees. The man was old, 70, perhaps a little more, but his posture carried an odd weight, not hunched in weakness, but balanced, as though his body remembered discipline even as time bent his frame. His weathered face bore a thin layer of unshaven stubble, silver blending into the creases of a jaw that had once been hard and unyielding. A faded army green jacket hung from his shoulders, zipped high against the cold, its elbows frayed and its collar worn smooth by years of use. His boots were cracked at the leather seams, soles patched but sturdy, the kind a man refused to throw away because they had carried him through too much. His eyes, partially hidden beneath the brim of a sun-bleached cap, were a stormy gray, restless yet still, like a sea that knew it could rise at any moment, but chose silence. Among the recruits was Private Jackson, a tall young man with broad shoulders and a face sculpted by arrogance. His skin was a deep brown, smooth and unscarred, and his jaw was free of the hardships that forged men older than him. Jackson had grown up in Chicago's South Side, the son of a mechanic who drank too much and left scars on his boy's sense of pride. It made Jackson loud, competitive, desperate to dominate every room before it could crush him. He had become the sharpest shot in his unit so far, and he let everyone know it, his laughter always louder, his jokes always crueler. When he spotted the old man, his instinct was not curiosity, but mockery, because anything that threatened to outshine him had to be belittled first. "Hey, maybe he's waiting for his grandson," Jackson sneered, his voice booming across the fog. A ripple of laughter followed. Private Lewis, a wiry kid from Texas with sandy hair sticking out from under his cap, slapped Jackson's arm and added, "Or maybe he's here to sweep the floor when we're done." The old man did not react. He simply shifted the case slightly, resting a gnarled hand on the lid, as though guarding something more precious than pride. Inside, his thoughts churned, but his face revealed nothing. He had heard laughter like this before, half a lifetime ago from boys who hadn't yet learned what bullets could do to flesh. He could still remember how quickly mockery turned to silence when the first firefight came, how fast arrogance bled out into the sand. He did not resent them. They were too young to know better. He simply watched, waited, and wondered if today might be the day he reminded someone that time had not yet defeated him. The fog thickened briefly, curling around the bleachers, and in that gray shroud, the old man remained a question no one wanted to ask. The fog had begun to thin by the time the recruits lined up at the firing stations, the sun breaking through in pale shards of light that glinted off the steel barrels of their rifles. Their boots scuffed against the gravel, their voices rose in chatter, and the old man remained seated until at last he unlatched the brass clasps on the long wooden case across his knees. The creak of the hinges was faint, but in that quiet lull between orders, it was enough to draw eyes. Slowly, he lifted the lid and revealed the weapon inside. It was an M14, scarred and aged, its wooden stock darkened with oil and years of handling, its steel dulled to a weary gray. Along the barrel ran scratches deep as if carved by stone or sand, and etched faintly on the butt was a name, worn down to illegibility. The rifle was out of time in this place, an artifact from a war the recruits only knew from their grandfathers' stories. Private Lewis let out a sharp laugh, his sandy hair falling into his eyes. "God almighty, it's a museum piece," he jeered. "Should hang that thing in a glass box, not drag it out here." The group erupted in laughter again, the sound bouncing across the range like cheap gunfire. Among them, Sergeant Miller narrowed his eyes. He was a man in his mid-40s, tall and broad, with a square jaw covered in a week's worth of dark stubble. His hair was clipped short, black-streaked with early gray, and his voice was the kind that cracked across a parade ground like a whip. Once, Miller had been the pride of his unit, a sniper in Iraq, but a single mistake, the wrong call during a rooftop mission in Fallujah, had cost a friend his life. Since then, Miller carried discipline like armor, unforgiving of weakness, intolerant of distractions. He watched the old man, not with laughter, but with a flicker of recognition, though he could not yet place why the sight of that M14 twisted his gut. The recruits continued their jokes, louder now, emboldened by one another. Private Jackson smirked wide, folding his massive arms across his chest. "Careful, old-timer," he shouted, his tone half taunting, half daring. "That antique might kick harder than you remember. Hate to see you snap a shoulder in front of the kids." The laughter swelled again, but beneath it, Miller barked the next round of orders, silencing them enough to restore order to the line. The old man, unbothered, ran a calloused thumb along the stock of the M14, his touch both tender and grave, as if each groove told him a story only he could hear. His mind drifted briefly, unbidden, to jungles dripping with rain, to nights when every rustle could be death, to faces long gone, but never forgotten. The weapon was no relic to him. It was memory, duty, survival, and for him, respect. He did not speak, did not defend the rifle against their ridicule. He simply looked past the recruits, his gray eyes fixing on the targets as though distance itself whispered to him. And though the fog had almost lifted, there was still a veil hanging over the range, a veil between what the boys thought they knew and what the old man carried in silence. The crack of rifles thundered across the range, each shot echoing against the canyon walls before dissolving into the thinning morning fog. Sergeant Miller barked commands with a voice honed sharp by decades of discipline. His words were clipped, exact, demanding precision, but the recruits were young and restless, their nerves leaking through in laughter, curses, and hurried reloads. Some bullets found their mark with a satisfying clang, others strayed wide, striking dirt or splintering the wooden frames that held the targets. The air reeked of gunpowder and sweat, and through it all, the old man sat unmoved, his gray eyes fixed somewhere beyond the range, as if searching for something no one else could see. Private Jackson, towering over most of his peers, strutted back from his lane with a grin carved across his face. His skin gleamed with sweat, his broad shoulders rolling with arrogant ease, and when he caught the sight of the old man again, he could not resist. "Hey, old-timer," he shouted, loud enough to cut through Miller's cadence. "Want to give it a try? Don't let that antique knock you into the dirt. Hate to see you break a hip in front of the kids." His laugh rolled out booming, joined by Private Lewis, whose sandy hair stuck to his forehead as he doubled over, slapping his thigh as if Jackson had just told the greatest joke alive. The chorus spread, half a dozen recruits chuckling nervously, their laughter carrying the scent of immaturity and insecurity. Yet not all joined. Private Hernandez, a lean young man with olive skin and dark, watchful eyes, stood stiffly at his lane, refusing to turn. Hernandez was quieter than the rest, shaped by growing up in a military family in New Mexico, where respect for elders was drilled into him alongside prayers before meals. He clenched his jaw at Jackson's words, his knuckles whitening on the grip of his rifle, but he said nothing, fearing the backlash of challenging the group's self-appointed leader. Sergeant Miller's head snapped toward the laughter, his square jaw tightening under the shadow of his stubble. For a moment his eyes hardened, the memory of that rooftop in Fallujah flashing unbidden, the sound of a man screaming because someone hadn't taken cover, because discipline had cracked. He hated this noise, this bravado, because he knew how quickly it unraveled in real combat. "Lock it down," he barked, the words slicing through the mockery. The laughter died abruptly, but the echoes lingered in the air like a stain. The old man neither flinched nor frowned. He shifted slightly, one hand resting again on the M14 beside him. His gaze drifted over the targets, the steel plates glimmering faintly in the sun, and for a moment he was far away, in a jungle where fog was heavier, in nights broken by gunfire, in days when men who laughed like these recruits did not live long enough to regret it. Yet his face remained unreadable, betraying nothing of the storm that lived behind those gray eyes. And though the recruits had laughed, a subtle change crept in. A few of them now stole glances at him, not with humor, but with something quieter, uncertain, almost uneasy. The laughter had died down, replaced by an uneasy quiet that clung to the range. Dust swirled at the recruits' boots as the morning sun burned off the last of the fog. Slowly, the old man rose from the bleachers, the movement deliberate, each step on the gravel landing like a drumbeat in the silence. The wooden case hung at his side, its weight neither burden nor ornament, but a part of him, as though the years had welded man and rifle into one. When he reached the firing bench, he laid the case down with care, the click of the clasp snapping open loud in the hushed air. He lifted the M14, running a cloth across the steel barrel in a gesture that was both ritual and remembrance. His hands were worn, veined, scarred by time, yet steady. Hands that had held more than just weapons. Hands that had buried comrades, carried weight, written letters that never found their way home. His voice, when it came, was gravelly but firm, carrying across the range without needing to rise. "You said the record still stands. Let me try once. See if my hands still tremble." A ripple of surprise passed through the recruits. Private Jackson smirked, trying to recover his dominance with a scoff. "Hell, why not? Maybe we'll get a history lesson while we're at it." Yet his words landed weaker than before, lacking the same conviction. Private Hernandez glanced sideways at the old man, his chest tightening, his upbringing whispering respect even as silence held his tongue. Sergeant Miller froze at the words. His broad chest rose with a sharp breath, his square jaw tensing as if weighing authority against instinct. He looked at the old man's face, the calmness etched into every line, and something in him recognized the weight of unspoken history. Miller was not a man who bent easily, yet in that moment he gave a slow, respectful nod, as though acknowledging something sacred. Beside him stood Corporal Davis, Miller's assistant instructor. Davis was younger, in his early 30s, with auburn hair cropped close to his head, and a clean-shaven face marked by a faint scar that ran from his right eyebrow to the corner of his cheek. He had earned it in a training accident years ago, a grenade drill gone wrong that left him cautious and often skeptical. Davis leaned closer, whispering just loud enough for Miller to hear. "Sir, you sure about this? Liability alone." But Miller cut him off with a glare, the kind that silenced debate. The recruits shifted uneasily as the old man stepped closer to the firing line. He placed the M14 on the bench, his posture straight despite the weight of years pressing on his shoulders. He did not smile, did not boast. He simply stood there, his presence commanding without effort, his gray eyes fixed on the targets in the distance. For the first time that morning, none of the recruits laughed. The air itself seemed to still, waiting. The range fell into a silence so deep, it seemed unnatural. The recruits held their breath as Sergeant Miller raised his arm, the whistle poised between his fingers. The old man stood at the line, his M14 cradled with a reverence that spoke of decades past. There was no hesitation in his movements, no ritual of adjusting stance or exhaling deliberately into position. He simply existed with the rifle, as though weapon and man had always been one. The whistle shrieked. The first shot cracked, sharp and clean, striking steel with a metallic ring that echoed across the canyon. Before the echo faded, the second shot fired. Quicker, crisper, the rhythm startling in its efficiency. The targets fell in succession, each round a punctuation mark in a sentence only he could write. 3, 4, 5. His elbows hardly shifted, his shoulders rolled with subtle grace, every motion so economical that it felt like watching muscle memory transform into art. Among the recruits, mouths hung open. Jackson, who had mocked loudest, stood rigid now, his grin wiped clean, his eyes flickering between disbelief and awe. Lewis's laughter had died entirely. He gripped his rifle tighter, suddenly aware of how clumsy his own hands felt in comparison. Hernandez watched intently, his jaw clenched, but his eyes burning with a quiet respect, as though he were witnessing something sacred. Corporal Davis, arms crossed beside Sergeant Miller, muttered under his breath. Impossible. His green eyes, always skeptical, widened in spite of himself. Davis was a man who believed in procedure, in drills and repetition, but watching the old man's rhythm defied every formula. Beside him, Miller's stern expression softened, his square jaw tightening not with frustration, but with recognition. He had seen brilliance before, the kind that could not be taught, only earned in fire and blood. Shot 6, shot 7, shot 8. Steel rang like a hymn. The old man reloaded with a smoothness that defied his years. No fumbling, no wasted movement. The magazine clicked in place as naturally as breathing, and with a small adjustment of elevation, he fired again. 9, 10. The final plate swung violently before settling into stillness. The clock stopped. 14.1 seconds. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The recruits stared, their bodies locked in disbelief, their young minds scrambling to reconcile the myth they had laughed at with the reality standing before them. The air was heavy, as if the canyon itself had paused to honor the act. The old man lowered his rifle slowly, not with triumph, but with gentleness, as if returning an old friend to rest. There was no cheer, no applause, only silence, thick, reverent, unbroken. The final echo of steel had faded, leaving behind a silence heavier than the ringing itself. The recruits stood frozen in place, rifles hanging loosely in their hands, their young faces stripped of bravado. Even the wind seemed to still, as though the canyon understood what had just been witnessed. The old man lowered the M14 with quiet reverence, laying it across the bench like a relic returned to its altar. Private Jackson was the first to move. The towering recruit who had led the jeers now felt the weight of shame pressing into his chest. His broad shoulders, once so squared with arrogance, sagged slightly as he pulled off his cap. His deep brown skin glistened with sweat, and for the first time that morning, his voice broke with humility. "Sir," he murmured, lowering his head, the single syllable sounding less like a word and more like a confession. The gesture rippled through the line. Private Lewis, who had been quick to laugh at every jab, now swallowed hard, his pale face flushed red beneath the Arizona sun. He removed his own cap with a shaky hand, eyes fixed on the ground rather than the old man's face. Behind them, Private Hernandez straightened sharply, his jaw tight, but his gaze steady. He did not remove his cap with shame, but with respect, as if confirming silently what he had sensed all along, that the stranger was not just a man, but a lesson incarnate. Sergeant Miller stepped forward, boots crunching against gravel. His square jaw was locked tight, but his stern eyes softened as they rested on the old man. He had spent his career teaching discipline, but in this moment, even he felt like a student. Miller had saluted decorated officers, had stood at attention before generals, but never had he felt reverence more genuine than the quiet nod he gave now. Corporal Davis hesitated, his auburn hair catching the sunlight. His scar, a line of past failure, pulled slightly as he clenched his jaw. He was a man trained to question, to doubt, to calculate risk, but even he recognized authenticity when it stood in front of him. He too inclined his head, silent acknowledgement replacing skepticism. At the far end of the line stood Private Sarah Mitchell, one of the few female recruits. She was tall and lean, her blonde hair tucked tightly beneath her cap, her skin sun-browned from years of farm work in Kansas. Sarah was known among the group for her resilience, a quiet determination born from watching her mother raise 3 children alone after her father had walked out. She had joined the Navy not for glory, but for survival, to carve something of her own. As she raised her hand in salute, her blue eyes shimmered, not with awe alone, but with gratitude, as though the old man had just reminded her why she had chosen this path. The old man looked at them all, his storm-gray eyes steady, his face unreadable yet softened by something almost paternal. He offered nothing more than a slight bow of his head, a gesture so small and yet so weighty that it seemed to bind the air around them. He did not demand their respect. He returned it, simply quietly, with the humility of one who knew the true cost of reverence. And so the silence remained, not empty, not awkward, but sacred. The silence still lingered when the old man placed the M14 back into its wooden case. His weathered hands closed the clasps with care, the soft click echoing like the ending of a prayer. He turned, the weight of the rifle now tucked beneath his arm, and began to walk across the range. Each step seemed smaller than the last, his figure shrinking as the veil of midday haze began to thicken again. Private Jackson, cap clutched in his hand, felt a heaviness in his chest as he watched. The man he had mocked so easily now walked away like a shadow returning to the earth. Something inside Jackson cracked open, pride giving way to humility. For the first time since arriving at Fort Canyon, he wanted to be more than just the loudest voice. He wanted to be worthy. Sarah Mitchell, her blue eyes still fixed on the old man, felt an ache of admiration. She remembered her mother's weary hands working the Kansas soil and how she had promised herself to carve a better life. Watching the old veteran's quiet strength gave her more than motivation. It gave her a model. She whispered under her breath, almost like a vow, "I won't waste this chance." Sergeant Miller stood rigid, hands clasped behind his back. His broad jaw was locked, but his stern eyes softened with something close to gratitude. He had carried Fallujah's ghost for years, punishing recruits harshly to make up for his own mistake. Yet in this moment, he realized discipline was not only fear and rigidity, it was also dignity, the calm strength of a man who carried scars without needing to show them. Miller exhaled deeply, almost in relief, as though the old man had lifted a burden from his shoulders. Corporal Davis, ever the skeptic, felt the scar on his cheek itch as he watched the small figure disappear. For once his doubts found no ground to stand on. He looked to Miller, then to the recruits, and admitted quietly, "Guess some lessons don't come from manuals." His words surprised even himself. The old man reached the edge of the range and paused for just a moment. He did not turn fully, only tilted his head slightly toward the young soldiers standing at attention. His storm-gray eyes caught the sunlight one last time, and then he stepped beyond the haze. No car, no escort, no farewell. Only the certainty that he had given them something they would not forget. That evening, the recruits gathered again near the scoreboards. A brass plate had been fastened at lane 3, engraved with quiet permanence. 14 Wadia 1 seconds, old vet. No name, no rank, no unit. Just a line that carried the weight of everything they had seen. And in the weeks that followed, something shifted. Laughter remained, but it softened, no longer cruel. Reload slowed, attention sharpened. They learned to respect silence as much as noise. Fort Canyon never saw the old man again, but he was there in every shot they fired, every pause before a trigger pulled. They had not just witnessed a legend, they had been changed by him, and that was the happiest ending he could have left behind. There are moments when silence speaks louder than 1,000 words. The old veteran at Fort Canyon reminded us that true strength is not found in noise or boasting, but in patience, discipline, and the courage to act at the right time. In our daily lives, it is the same. Sometimes one quiet gesture, one timely action, can change how others see us, and even change the path ahead. Thank you so much for joining us for this story. We hope it brought you inspiration, peace, and strength to carry with you. May you have good health, joy, and many meaningful days surrounded by your loved ones. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone you care about, so they too can find encouragement. Leave a comment below to tell us about the lessons or moments in your life that inspired you. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button to stay with us for more human stories that uplift and inspire.